Welcome to the All Things Nintendo podcast. I'm Brian Shea, and this is a weekly podcast to discuss all the biggest news and games from the world of Nintendo. As you are listening to this episode, I am out on the road handling a couple of freelance opportunities, so I am pre-recording this episode. As usual, if any news breaks, I will be sure to circle back next week. However, we have a good topic for you as we are celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Sega Dreamcast launching in the United States. And joining me for that is my good friend, Dr. Ben Richlin. Ben, how are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you doing today, Brian?
I am doing really well. I'm excited to talk about what I consider one of the most underrated consoles of all time. And, I know that you have some pretty hardcore affection for it as well, and the era that Sega existed during that time. And it's interesting because, like, a couple weeks ago, I did an episode on the 35th anniversary of the Sega Genesis with the best-selling author of Console Wars, Blake J. Harris.
Oh, cool, yeah.
So he came on and we talked about, the battle between Sega and Nintendo. And this almost feels like it's going to be a sequel to that episode, talking about, because, we ran that episode all the way up to, and then they did the Dreamcast. And now it's like, here we get to kind of see that through to the end.
Didn't that book get an anime?
I mean, it got everything. It got documentaries. It got a docu-series.
They made like an anime based off that book. Are we going to get an anime?
That would be nice. So we're going to be talking all about Sega, its attempt to recover from the Saturn, and the results that it gave us with the Dreamcast. But before we dig into that, Ben, we have a time-honored tradition for debuting guests on the All Things Nintendo podcast. I'm going to ask you two questions so the audience can get to know you through the lens of Nintendo. The segment is called First Nintendo Game, Favorite Nintendo Game. So the first of those two questions is, what is your first memory with Nintendo? What was your first Nintendo game, first Nintendo console? Whatever comes to mind when I ask you for your first Nintendo game.
I don't remember anything specific before this exact moment that I'm about to tell you.
All right.
So I'm sure that there were some things, but Hanukkah, 5th grade, got my first Game Boy Color and Pokemon Blue. That was my first, me owning a Nintendo game.
Do you remember what year that is?
That was
it 98?
98, yeah, 1998.
Okay, so I got that exact same. Was it the translucent purple Game Boy Color?
So here's the thing, Brian. I thought I was the coolest kid on the block because I had a translucent blue Game Boy Color. Then I went to school, and I said, check out my new cool Game Boy Color. It's translucent and blue. And everybody was like, I said see-through blue, whatever. And everybody was like, that's purple. Then I went home, and I said, Mom, I might be colorblind. I think I need to get my eyes checked.
So I got that exact same experience. Christmas of 1998, I got a translucent purple Game Boy Color.
Yeah.
And Pokemon Blue.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you also find out you were colorblind?
No, I found out my eyes work just fine.
You had a better experience than me.
Well, at least, wait, what did the game look like? Because, if you played Pokemon Blue on a Game Boy Color, it was blue.
So, the thing is that it has to do with shades for me. Certain purples look blue, but that blue looked blue. And I just remember just playing that game, and I had no barrier. I had no entry point to know what I was getting myself into. I would just go, I loved the cartoon, the anime, and I would go to school and I tell my friends I know I'm getting the Game Boy Color and Pokemon, and they're like, pick Bulbasaur, pick that, and I'm thinking how's that going to look? Is it going to be like a wheel and I have to pick it from a starter? I didn't know what the game looked like. There weren't the internet didn't exist. There was no game trailers. There was nothing for a point of entry for me to see and understand it unless I asked somebody else. When I beat the Elite Four, I was so excited that I ran around my house. Game Boy Color went flying out of my hand. Cartridge went flying out, and my game got deleted, and I had to restart. And
so you didn't even get to go to Mewtwo?
No, I had to restart and with Squirtle, and so. That's my Pokemon journey, my very first one.
Wow. Did you keep up with the series after that?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Just all the time. I played the card game actually competitively. I got to travel the country and stuff, and I got to actually staff events. I actually got to be in the giant Pikachu costume for the World Championships in Vancouver. which was insane. Um, I played every single mainline Pokemon series game, a couple spin-offs here and there, like, XD, Gale of Darkness, Coliseum, Battle Revolution, Snap, um, Stadium, like all of those. And so but my favorite Pokemon game, I know that this isn't a question, but I'm going to mention it anyway, is probably Heart Gold Soul Silver.
That's mine.
Yeah, it is the perfect recreation of Pokemon Crystal and that entire vibe. And it is the perfect Pokemon game.
Yeah, I would agree with you 100% there. And I wish they would re-release it on Switch because it's so good.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah.
form of that, right? Like,
Yeah.
I also want Fire Red, Leaf Green. I think those are fantastic remakes as well.
It's a weird Nintendo decision, WND. Come on. Give us what we want here.
I mean, this might be a weird Pokemon Company decision, more so than a weird Nintendo decision.
That's true. Weird Pokemon decision, yeah.
Because Nintendo's been doing a great job of putting their classic games on like Switch Online and stuff. And
they have, for sure. Absolutely. This Pokemon, there's for some reason, it's such a hard thing to want to do game preservation, which is a little frustrating. But, hopefully we get to revisit the Johto region in some way.
Yeah, I was actually hoping that the next Pokemon Legends game would be taking place in the Johto region, and then it would kind of be like what they did with Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. It's like, the Hisui region was based on the region from Diamond and Pearl, Sinnoh, yeah. And so I was hoping they would be like, okay, well, the next Legends game is going to be based in Johto, and then before Johto was founded, and then eventually you would be able to get like a remake, like a modern remake of the Johto games, but doesn't seem like that's the route they're going.
It doesn't seem like it. It was an interesting swerve to do X, Y, and Z to A or whatever it's going to be called. I'm looking forward to it. Like, I actually really loved Pokemon Legends Arceus.
So did
I had a lot of fun with that one.
Yeah, that was the best game that came out, or the best Pokemon game that came out that year, because you remember that's also the same year we got Scarlet and Violet, which I liked that game a lot. It just had a lot of technical problems.
Most fun I've had in a seemingly broken game.
Yes, I would agree with you. But that brings us to the second part of this question, which is, what is your favorite Nintendo game of all time?
Okay. So I thought about this a lot. And you know what? I'm just going to say, there might be some recency bias, but Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, it just blew me away. And the experience also of getting it too. I actually went to the midnight launch for that game at Nintendo New York City.
Oh, awesome. I was supposed to be there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I got COVID, so I couldn't go. Yeah.
Oh, shoot. Okay. Yeah, no, but I got to see Gene from Washington Post. I got to see Jeff Keighley. It was just I got to meet Doug Bowser. That was awesome. Insane. And it was actually my birthday. And so he actually signed my copy of the collector's edition, and it was the only copy that he signed of the game.
Wow.
And so they had it all signed and ready for me when it was being rung up. And he wrote, "To Dr. Ben, enjoy the journey." And I sunk 360 hours in that sucker. It was just so much fun. Just I'd be on the phone with a friend who's also playing it, and I'm like, I just found this crazy place in Hyrule Castle, where I'm using all these bombs to blow up all these different, and there's all these branching pathways. It was just such a joy to get lost in that game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, my answer for that is Breath of the Wild, so I'm right there with you. And those games are just so fantastic. They have so many great water cooler moments. And, Tears of the Kingdom, I think it's up there with Breath of the Wild in terms of how good it is. It might even be a better game. I just think that in terms of impact, Breath of the Wild just hit me a little bit harder.
That's true. The impact of Breath of the Wild cannot be understated. And I don't think that you can just recreate that. Tears of the Kingdom, it didn't recreate it. It recreated different things. Mm-hmm. Or it created different things, but also recreated a little bit of what Breath of the Wild did. But I digress. Look, having these wonderful games, there's no problem with that.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually been thinking like, I have a little bit of time now, even though I wouldn't know it because I'm constantly doing stuff. Like I've been just so busy this week alone,
Mm,
but I've been thinking like, oh, should I just like start over and like replay Breath of the Wild all the way through Tears of the Kingdom? It's like,
boy.
no, I shouldn't. I should definitely check out these other games that I need to
Yeah,
check out.
yeah,
Like there's so many titles that I need to play still, but yeah, those are great answers. I mean, Pokemon, you could do a lot worse, like with your introduction to Nintendo, and then Tears of the Kingdom, phenomenal game, one of my favorite, probably top 15 games of all time for me.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
But before we dive into Dreamcast Central here, just want to give a reminder that you can support the All Things Nintendo podcast in a variety of ways. The biggest and best is the Patreon page, where you can come in at the $5 or $10 level and unlock perks like early and ad-free episodes, as well as an entire second weekly podcast called All Things Gamers, where I cover the entire games industry. You also get access to the All Things Nintendo community Discord, where we have some of the best people over there chatting about all of our favorite hobby. And then you can also help the cause by checking out the official All Things Nintendo merchandise store on tpublic.com. Look for the link in the description of the show, and then also subscribe to the YouTube channel, where I put up not only the full video versions of this very podcast, but also shorts and clips and all kinds of other stuff. So go check that out as well. So, Ben, before we jump into the actual history of Dreamcast, without going into too many specifics, because I want to ask you a few elements of your history with the Dreamcast here.
Yeah.
What was your experience with the Sega Dreamcast?
My experience with the Sega Dreamcast was walking through a Best Buy and going to an end cap and seeing the trailer for Sonic Adventure
Mm-hmm.
and not knowing what the hell is going on. The internet was still like in its very like early days. I didn't really understand game journalism and all that stuff. I basically just sort of stayed in my own bubble. I followed whatever was going on with Pokemon. I followed whatever was going on with whatever cartoon I was watching, all that sort of stuff. But I saw the first trailer for Sonic Adventure and I was like, that's what's happening with Sonic. I haven't played him since Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
Like I didn't have a Saturn. And I only own Sonic 2 and Knuckles, Sonic and Knuckles. So
Wait, you didn't own Sonic 3? So you didn't get to play Sonic 3 and Knuckles like the combined?
I did not get to, no, but I combined Sonic 2 with
So you could play
Knuckles.
Knuckles in Sonic 2.
Yeah.
But still, like Sonic 3 and Knuckles is like
I
the
know.
ultimate experience.
I know. One of these days I will play it with the original soundtrack for sure.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until Sonic Adventure 2 came out that I actually got a Dreamcast. I wanted one, but my parents weren't just going to get me a new console willy-nilly, I remember when like the last day of 7th grade, I came home and my mom had told me like, once you come home, we're going to go out to Media Play. We're going to pick up your Dreamcast. And I knew it was this bundle that came with Sonic Adventure 1, Sonic Shuffle, and
lucky you.
Yeah, I know, right? And a demo disc for Sonic Adventure 2, as well as a voucher for a discount for Sonic Adventure 2.
Ooh.
And I came home with my friend Tony, and I was just always such a clown. And I came home and I did something to cheese off my mom to the point where she was like, "We are not going to go to Media Play and pick this up." And I was just so upset. A month or two later, we were in Boston visiting my grandma, and I saw the Dreamcast in store, and I was like, it was my birthday, but I didn't really do anything, and we got it there. And so I then also just traded in the voucher for Sonic Adventure 2, and I was just blown away. This thing was just ahead of its time. Now, I had already listened to the music because I had used Napster and LimeWire and everything to listen to all the Sonic music. And yes, I've told Johnny this, and yes, I owe him several in royalties. But
it was impossible to buy those albums back then.
Right? Yeah.
We'll get to your relationship with Johnny Giueli, the singer of Crush 40, a little bit later in the show. But once I got into Crush 40, I was like, oh, well, I want to check out Hardline, his other band.
Yeah.
And I went to every record store I could fine trying to find a hardline album. I eventually had to resort to piracy as well, because you
Yeah.
literally couldn't unless you
Yeah.
wanted to pay like $80 to import the CD.
Right? Yeah, it was insane. But just playing that thing was just so. I have such weird memories of it, because like I remember when I was in 8th grade, there was like a campaign that we were all doing as students to sell magazines. And like the person that sold the most magazines won a black and white handheld television. And
Whoa.
yeah, I know. And I was like, oh, great, I get to have a television in my bedroom. And that's what I played my Dreamcast on. What was I thinking? Now, I would also bring it downstairs and, plug it into an actual TV and not something that ran on like 18B cells. But like, that was just like, I can't believe myself as a kid.
That is amazing. My story was a little bit less wild.
Unhinged, yeah.
Yes, unhinged is a good word for that. I basically had this one neighbor who, and he was a dad, so he was like a lot older than I was. He was like my parents' age, but his kids were a little bit younger than me. And I remember it was so cool. He had like an arcade in his basement. He had like one of those basketball hoops. He had, I think, skee ball. He had a couple pinball machines, and he had a few arcade cabinets. And then you went into the other room, and he had a big screen TV and like every console that like was currently like active. And I remember he got a Dreamcast when it first came out, and he invited me over to see it. And he basically was like, all right, I'm just going to like give you the controller for Sonic Adventure, because he knew I was a big Sonic fan. And you can just play for like a couple hours. And I remember playing it and just being like, my life has changed.
Yeah.
Like, I'm never going to be the same. I need this thing. So I started like, mowing grasses and like babysitting and everything, so I could save up enough money. And like, I got like a very modest allowance growing up. And then eventually I saved up enough to buy my Dreamcast and Sonic Adventure 1 and a VMU, which again, we will talk more about that in a little bit. But yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah.
As we covered in the Genesis episode a couple of weeks ago, Sega was extremely competitive with Nintendo in the early half of the 90s. And this was largely thanks to the Sega Genesis and its Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. And then the Genesis was able to directly take on the NES and then later the SNES. And it ended up selling more than 30 million units. So pretty respectable. Not on the level of SNES. I believe the SNES sold like 56 million units. So Sega did fall well short of the SNES, but it showed up and was a respectable number 2 in that era.
It was enough for them to say, let's keep going. Let's stay in the hardware game.
And unfortunately, that's where they faltered, because various add-on consoles like the Sega CD and 32X didn't really carry on that success. And then the surprise US launch of the Sega Saturn in 1995 was kind of a turning point, because they did it to they did it to beat the PlayStation to market, because they heard like, oh, the PlayStation, it's going to be a huge juggernaut of sales. We need to get our Sega Saturn out before Sony launches its PlayStation. And so they had Tom Kalinske, who was the then president of Sega of America. Oh, God, he would have killed me if he heard me call him the president of Nintendo.
Yeah.
The then president of Sega of America get up at E3 1995 and say, it's available now. And he told me in an interview that this was one of the main reasons he ended up leaving Sega, is because Hayao Nakayama, the CEO of overall Sega, because Sega is a Japanese company and then Sega of America is a subsidiary, he forced Tom Kalinske to make that announcement. And Tom was like, I didn't even think we were ready for the fall launch. I thought we should have had like another year to get this console ready, because there was no launch lineup really. There was no there was just no like retail space that they had really negotiated, because back then that was a huge part of getting sales, is you had to have the shelf space. And Sega had fought tooth and nail against Nintendo to get shelf space, because Nintendo would kind of have these like almost like cartel-esque tactics where they would go to the retailers and be like, hey, if you want to sell our stuff, you have to give us like 85% of the shelf space, or whatever arbitrary number they threw out there.
That's crazy. That's so like when I was at Toys R Us, like I'd see like behind the glass cabinets and it was just all Nintendo.
So yeah, they did that.
Section of Sega.
They did that, and I mean, they bought up a lot of like chips and everything and cartridge casings that they knew Sega would need. So they kind of created this artificial shortage, and then artificial shortage at retail shelves as well. And Sega finally fought and broke through and got it. So this move was a huge betrayal to retailers, and Tom Kalinske knew it, and that's ultimately one of the main reasons he left Sega shortly after that. So the result of that was, the Saturn was out actually first in Japan by the time they made this announcement, and it was actually selling pretty well. But the first 4 months in particular, after they announced, hey, it's available now, they struggled to get retailers to be able to stock their shelves because like nobody knew this was coming. So they didn't have like the stock ready to send out. Retailers didn't have shelf space allocated to it. And they just were completely unprepared for it. And not only that, but developers just struggled to get games to market on time because they also were kind of left in the dark about this.
I feel like I never touched a controller for Sega Saturn, ever.
I played it at my my grandparents' house. My uncle brought it over after he just got it. This was like probably 6 or 7 months after launch. And I was like, whoa, this is awesome. I should get one of these. And then like by the time I even considered like saving up the money, it was already discontinued.
Yeah, like it's kind of one of those things that just sort of came and went and didn't really have, I feel, an impact.
Yeah, it really didn't. I mean, it was cool because it was able to replicate some arcade style games, but that was really the extent of it, right? And like, so Tom Kalinske got up and he made that announcement, and then he quit Sega, and he was replaced by Shoichiro Iramajiri and Bernie Stoller. And then he joined as the Sega of America vice president in charge of product development and third-party relations. So both those names, Iramajiri and Stoller, are going to be pretty big names that we're going to be coming back to over the course of this history. And, Saturn didn't have a real Sonic game. It had Sonic Jam, which was a compilation of the Genesis games. And there was like a little 3D area you could run around that was kind of like a tech demo.
Didn't it have like an updated 3D Blast?
It did, but it wasn't like, it wasn't an all new game. And then it had Sonic Extreme that was in development. But that was stuck in development hell and then eventually was canceled. And that was being developed by a separate development team.
Sentient? Chris Senna or something like that.
Chris Sen was the he's working on that, and it's funny because he did eventually come back and work on the franchise on the Sonic Boom games. So he has a really interesting history. I got to interview him for an article that I wrote, probably 2017.
Oh wow!
So very interesting stories coming out of him. But yeah, by the time this the Saturn was like starting to get up any momentum, PlayStation and N64 were out. And they were absolutely dominating the sales charts. So I reference Steve Kent's Ultimate History of Video Games book quite often, and like when I'm doing these historical lookbacks. By 1997, Sony controlled 47% of the console market, Nintendo was at 40%, and Sega had just 12%.
This was 1997?
Yes.
That's insane. That
was a huge drop off.
That's just like really hard to picture because it felt like, how did Sony get so quick at this?
They launched and they had a great marketing plan and they had recognizable mascots. They had Spyro, they had Crash Bandicoot, they even had Croc, if people remember Croc.
Right, yeah.
They had a lot of sports games. They really shot out of the cannon, right? Like as soon as they were huge. They had promotional deals with every company. Like you go to Pizza Hut and you get like a PlayStation 1 demo disc. They had Tony Hawk's Pro Skater that was on the horizon, which, blew everybody away. I mean, N64 had that as well. But so in the wake of this, where Sega had been reduced down to 12% of the market share, which is just unheard of after how strong they were with the Genesis, Hayao Nakayama resigned as president of Sega. And then in 1998, just a year after that, the company discontinued the Saturn. It sold 9 million units worldwide. Wow. So that's honestly not as bad as you would think.
It's so like when we're saying dates like this, just putting like into perspective, like 1998 is when I got Pokemon and the Game Boy Color, and also found out I was colorblind. And that was also the same time when the Sega Saturn was discontinued. It's so mind-boggling because games journalism was not on the internet. At least heavily, maybe even at all. And so it's not something that I followed unless I picked up a magazine or something like that.
Yeah, I got most of my info on the internet at AOL keywords and
Yeah.
like forums and stuff. Most of that stuff ended up being fake, but
Yes, yes, yes. Go here to find the Pokemon named Anthrax or find a Nido God or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely insane. So yeah, no, that's crazy.
So when Bernie Stolar came in, he started building his team, and he had to restructure Sega of America. So get this: we talked a lot about like layoffs and everything
Hmm.
in this show over the course of the last year and a half or so.
Yeah.
300 people were working at Sega of America when he came in. He trimmed it all the way down to about 90 people.
Oh my
That's
God.
almost a 70% reduction in workforce. That's a huge drop off. But I mean, based on how far the business had fallen, I guess it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, and the reasoning was because of just the really crappy numbers that they were dealing with, and how how long did they already start development on the Dreamcast, or am I getting ahead of things?
They were just getting started, but yeah, we'll get to that in just a second.
Yeah.
So, as part of this restructuring, he also brought in a couple of other executives. So he brought in former Reebok executive Peter Moore, former Sony executive Gretchen Eichinger, and then others like Chris Gilbert to head up sales and Charles Belfield for communications. And there was an article that I found by Douglas Perry for Gama Sutra
Mm.
that was a retrospective for the 15th anniversary. So it was written 10 years
Oh,
ago.
Jesus.
And a lot of the information in this episode, it comes from a variety of episodes, but I think that one was the primary one that I pulled from. Very well written, great chronological, separated out into different things. I highly recommend it. If you can find it, I think it's only on Internet Archive. So
Mm.
good luck.
Yeah, yeah.
So here's what Stoller said in that article on building his team. He said, "We had to change the attitude of retail to believe we were a serious player. And because of the whole Saturn thing, retailers really hated Sega. It took me a lot of work to change their minds. I went to every retailer and I told them this was going to be a great system. It was going to have a modem, it was going to have online play, this was the content it was going to have, and this is what it was going to look like. They all bought into that. They all trusted me. Plus, they really liked the team I put together. They felt this was the right team."
Holy God.
So he had to go and repair all I mean, because, like I said, Tom Kalinske fought tooth and nail to get the retailers on Sega's side. And then the Saturn with like the rushed launch and the terrible rollout plan and awful software library. It dashed so much goodwill with like all the big retailers that were around at the time, the Toys R Us's, the Kmart's, all
Yeah.
those. So Stoller had to go around and repair that goodwill and be like, look, all the people who made those decisions that screwed you guys over, they're gone. Now this is the new guard. We are going to work with you. We're going to make this right. We're going to make sure that this is like a good launch. It's a great console. Here's all the stuff it can do. So that was one of his main tasks.
Make the movie.
I mean, this would be a great follow up, right, to Console Wars?
Yeah, yeah. Call it Dreamcast. Like there it is. Like that. Like it writes itself. But it just like it's so crazy that like it really lends to how heavy the industry is built on relationships and like just fostering those relationships, repairing relationships. That's insane.
Yeah. So thankfully, he was able to repair that, and he was able to get all these retailers back on Sega's side. And then in 1997, just so we have the timeline, we're going to kind of go back a year or two here to 1997. Iri Jamiri sought out Tatsuo Yamamoto from IBM, and he asked him to lead an external team in charge of creating the next Sega console as a group of outsiders, because the internal team kind of messed things up and left a bad taste in their mouth about from the Saturn. So they wanted to see what an external team could do. So Yamamoto headed up an 11-person team to work on what they called Project Black Belt. And then meanwhile,
that's a cool name.
It is.
That's a really cool name.
So depending on where you look, Gama Sutra says Hideki Sato was asked by Sega to lead an internal team on creating a new console prototype, while Edge and Retro Gamer say Sato was so annoyed that Irijimiri brought in an outside team to try and make the next console prototype that he started his own internal team to work on the next Sega console to be like, we can do better. And
Interesting.
he initially codenamed it Project White Belt.
Oh,
And, and
okay.
then later it was called Dural, which was a character in the Virtua Fighter series.
Gotcha.
Um,
Okay. Took a turn that I wasn't expecting.
hey, I mean, maybe Dural's a white belt. Who knows?
Yeah, yeah.
So Sega of America's Stolar wanted the externally created Yamamoto design, while Sega of Japan's Iri Jamiri, I'm going to mess up that name so many times, he
It's
preferred
okay.
Sato's creation.
Yeah.
So they clashed a little bit, and ultimately they ended up going with the one more similar to Sato's internal specs because it was cheaper and it used Japanese created components from companies that Sega had pre-existing relationships with. So
Hmm.
this was largely done to counter how expensive the price tag was of the Saturn. So Sato ultimately got his way. Like his team's specs were most closely resembling what the final Dreamcast was. And as part of this decision to kind of, you know, largely side with Sato's design, but also take elements of Yamamoto's, they renamed the console Project Katana.
Ah, okay. No more fists, no more kicks, no more elbows, none of that stuff. We're just gonna go straight into swords now.
Yes, jumping right in, bringing a sword to a console war.
Yeah, yeah. Let me ask you something. How much was the Saturn?
I don't know. We can look that up though. We have the technology.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was $400
Oh my
at launch,
God.
which
Yeah,
in 2023 money, according to Wikipedia, would be the equivalent of $800.
but it did include a copy of Virtua Fighter.
Well, there's that, I
Apparently.
guess.
Yeah. I don't know.
So yeah, so that was a big component of that, and the Saturn was just a unmitigated disaster for Sega in terms of promotions and like I said, severing relationships. During the Genesis episode, I talked about how prevalent EA and in particular EA Sports was on that console. That sports games were a huge selling point for the Genesis, and unfortunately, the Power VR architecture used by the Dreamcast concerned Electronic Arts and led to them hesitating to create games for the Dreamcast. But on the other hand, Sega was touting how compatibility was actually one of the key selling points to developers. So, one of the cool things about the architecture of the Dreamcast that I read about was that it allowed for developers to create software before the dev kits were even finished because it used hardware that let them have it so that anything that could run on an Intel Pentium 2 processor
Mm.
could run on the Dreamcast. And then Sega, on top of that, also worked with Microsoft to create a custom version of Windows CE for the Dreamcast, which made it so developers could easily port PC games to the console.
How do they make these like deals with them in order to like make these things happen? Like especially after a failure.
Yeah, I mean, they're reaching out and trying to forge these partnerships. All kinds of people are coming from all these different walks of the industry and everything. So like, this is before Xbox was a thing. So
Yeah.
like, the Saturn was originally going to be a collaboration between Sega and Sony,
Mm.
but then they fell off, and then PlayStation went off and did their own thing. So Sony was looking for a gaming partner for the longest time. They were going to collaborate with Nintendo, they were going to
I
collaborate with
remember.
Sega,
Yeah.
and then they ultimately just went their own way, and I guess it worked out okay.
Yeah.
So that was kind of like the base hardware for the Dreamcast. But then, after discussions with Chinese economist Brad Huang, Sega decided to include a modem with every Dreamcast that would allow for online play, web surfing, and downloads. And this move was actually highly controversial within Sega because, as I mentioned before, they were trying to price cut at every turn. They were trying to use cheaper components. They were trying to use, different ways to make it so that this was just not going to cost them an arm and a leg to manufacture. But including the modem would have made each Dreamcast cost $15 more to produce. So it was, they had to fight tooth and nail, but ultimately they did decide to go with the modem because they thought it would give them a leg up on the incoming consoles and the ones that are already on market. And then Sega also cut costs by using, instead of CD-ROMs, they used the newer GD-ROMs. And then that was also, so it was about the same price as CD-ROMs, but it was a little bit bigger.
Hmm.
but it also was way cheaper than the upcoming DVD ROMs that were being used in future consoles.
You have to figure that one of these companies was going to be first out of the gate doing something with the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunate that it was the one that ended up failing and ended up being like the nail in the coffin for it. And I think that that's really why everybody, I mean, I think that that among other reasons is one of the main things for the Dreamcast being ahead of its time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are so many things about the Dreamcast that are way ahead of its time. Thankfully, not the release date, because they didn't come up and announce it as a surprise launch like they did with the Saturn. They learned their lesson.
They picked a badass, date though, 9/9/99.
Yeah, they
That was
did. But
cool.
it was first revealed in May of 1998 in
Mm.
Tokyo, and they actually held a competition to name the console, which is reminiscent of the competition that they held to design its mascot Sonic. I don't know if you remember that story.
No.
So yeah, they held an internal competition for that to design their next mascot, and Naoto Oshima was
Yes.
the one that he submitted the winning design. But this time the competition was open to the public, and the name they chose was Dreamcast, which was a portmanteau of the words dream and broadcast.
Oh. Okay.
So according to Damian McFerrin's Dreamcast retrospective for Retro Gamer, which you can actually read right now on nintendolife.com, due to the disastrous launch of the Saturn and how bad it was for Sega's reputation, the company actually considered removing Sega from the name altogether and instead founding a new gaming division similar to how Sony did with PlayStation, and separating out Sega as like its arcade business and all of its other holdings that Sega Sammy has.
Yeah.
Kind of mirroring what PlayStation did, where it's like you didn't. I mean, people called it the Sony PlayStation, but if you talked about like their gaming division, you were just talking about PlayStation. So they were worried that the Sega name had been tainted by the Saturn, but ultimately they decided to keep the Sega name attached to the Dreamcast and launched it as the Sega Dreamcast. So here's the other thing: launch was coming in late 1998 in Japan, and Power VR had chipset shortages, and
Oh.
Sega could not meet all the pre-order demand. So Dreamcast launched in Japan November 27th, 1998, sold out immediately. Unfortunately, two of the launch titles, Sonic Adventure and Sega Rally Championship 2, were delayed at the last minute. So the Dreamcast launched with only 4 games, and of those, the only successful game was Virtua Fighter 3. So not a particularly great start to Sega's
No.
supposed comeback. And according to Steve Kent's Ultimate History of Video Games, Sega predicted that it would have sold an additional 300,000 units right off the bat if it had the supply that it needed.
Wow.
So, talking about challenges and launching in the West and why Sega delayed its launch in the US for nearly a year, I found this
Yeah.
quote from Iramajiri in a 2000 roundtable interview with press, and I found this transcription on GameSpot. He said, quote, Sega is in a much more difficult position in North America and Europe. It'll be more difficult to penetrate those markets than Japan. Sega has to prepare its best efforts for the launch. It will take certain quantity and quality. Some developers of the US and European developers, or some of the US and European developers have already started developing games for Dreamcast, but Sega is concentrating only on the Japanese market this year. So Sonic Adventure and Sega Rally Championship 2 eventually came out shortly after launch, but they didn't even sell particularly well. And in response, Sega cut the price from 29,000 yen, which, ballparking it would probably be nearly $300.
Yeah.
To 19,900 yen, which again, ballparking is probably about $200 back then.
Right.
And then it bolstered its lineup with the likes of the popular arcade fighting game Soul Calibur. And then that proved successful. But can you guess what the first bona fide hit in Japan on Dreamcast was?
I'm gonna say something a little more like, you know what? Crazy Taxi.
No, it's even more obscure than that. Seaman.
Brian.
So
That can't be a
if you're
name.
not sure what it is, it used a microphone peripheral. So, the Dreamcast controller had two ports on the top. One you could put in the
Yes.
VMU. The
Yeah.
other one you could put like a rumble pack or something in there. This you put a microphone in. It was almost like Hey You Pikachu for N64.
Oh my
So
God.
it was a fish with a man's face, and you could talk to him, and your job is to take care of him. And the English version, they actually got Leonard Nimoy of Star Trek fame to do the narration for the game. But it was like just really weird, like off the wall thing. But it proved to be the first big hit for the Dreamcast in Japan.
I mean, I guess it was just so different and goofy.
It is a very goofy game, and like the guy evolves as you take care of him and everything, and very strange game. Look up some videos of Seaman if you
How do I spell that?
Seaman.
Oh, that's great.
So as the Western release was approaching, Sega was actually still in talks to convince EA Sports to bring its games over to Dreamcast. And according to that Gamasutra article, EA wanted an exclusivity contract with Sega to be the only sports brand on Dreamcast. So Sega declined because it was actually already working with a studio that it had acquired called Visual Concepts to create the following franchises: NBA 2K, NFL 2K, NHL 2K, NCAA College Football 2K, NCAA College Basketball 2K, and World Series Baseball 2K. Back then, it was known as Sega Sports. And when EA wouldn't budge on that demand to be the only sports brand on the Dreamcast, Sega walked away from the negotiating table.
I hate to do this, but I'm going to cause a little bit of derailed thinking because I did look up Seaman, and there's just something so wonderful about seeing a caution sign that says "Caution, Seaman," and it's just a silhouette of a fish man. It's just
I believe he's a frog man on the cover art.
It's basically. No, like I mean, yeah, that's. I paid a little attention to what you were saying, but
basically, EA Sports wanted
Yes.
to be the only sports brand able to release games on the Dreamcast, even though Sega owned a studio focused on developing sports games in the 2K series,
Right.
or Sega Sports Series as they were known back then.
Yeah.
And Sega walked away from the table because EA Sports was like, no, we want to be the only brand in town to release games on the Dreamcast.
Wow.
So
unbelievable.
Yeah. And then, eventually that would come back again because, to get rid of NFL 2K, EA Sports would sign an exclusivity contract with the NFL and make it so they're the only company that can release NFL games with the Madden franchise. So that ultimately killed the NFL 2K franchise. So exclusivity contracts have not done particularly well for the 2K series, it would seem.
No.
So Chris Belfield, who you may remember, was brought on by Stolar to be the VP of communications at Sega. In that Gamasutra article, they interviewed him. He said, quote, "The fact that EA didn't support us was a ding against us, but I'm not sure what breakthrough game EA would have given the platform from September 1999 through January 2001 that we hadn't already gotten in the same genre. Sports, the power of Madden brand, sure, but NFL 2K had a breakthrough experience." And I don't know if you played these NBA and NFL 2K games. They were fantastic. I preferred them over Madden and NBA Live.
I think I played NBA at some point, just like once or twice. But other than that, I wasn't really like into the whole sports games. They just weren't my thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's not everybody's thing. I did an episode of All Things Gamers, the show that you had appeared on. Speaking of the Patreon page that I mentioned earlier.
Yes.
You were on the first official episode. I did one solo, and then I had you on as my first guest. But the next episode that I did, was we talked about the current state of sports games. And people, they're not for everybody. But the NFL 2K and NBA 2K were obviously a very important component of the Dreamcast experience. They showed that there is more than one major player in town for these sports genres. And NBA 2K is still going extremely strong, even though there's also a lot of controversy with its approach to monetization and microtransactions. But it's still one of the biggest sports franchises in the world.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
So that might be one of the biggest legacies of the Dreamcast. Actually, is launching that NBA 2K series.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I think that there's so many things about the Dreamcast that it's not a footnote of history. It is an important stepping stone, and it's an
Mm-hmm.
important milestone.
So Sega wasn't able to partner with EA Sports, but they did partner with Midway to have 4 launch titles for the Dreamcast because they learned their lesson. They said like, hey, look, we launched the Dreamcast in Japan at too high of a price. We didn't have enough supply, and we didn't have enough games at launch. 4 games is not enough to launch a console with. So they maybe overcorrected a little bit here. So the result was 18 games available at launch with the heavily promoted 99.99 release date that you mentioned earlier,
Yep.
and priced at $200. And it avoided the Power VR shortage, thankfully, that messed up the Japanese launch. The only thing that did work against them was one of Sega's manufacturing plants actually suffered a problem where it was producing faulty discs. So some of the games
Oh,
weren't able to get on shelves, but the consoles were getting there just fine. So that's the good news. But
like
there was a shortage of some games.
how much of a setback? Like, is this like quantifiable?
I didn't see any numbers that showed like,
Okay,
oh well, it really screwed them up, but it did say that it affected the launch. It didn't
gotcha.
hinder them because they sold more than 225,000 units in the first 24 hours. It made it the fastest selling console ever at the time.
Yeah.
And Sega's market share in the launch window of the Dreamcast rose from 12% with the Saturn to 31%. So huge
Wow.
comeback.
Yeah.
And then Peter Moore, you may remember, was brought in as part of
Mm-hmm.
Stolar's team. Here's his quote on Gamasutra. It said, "The biggest sales day in movie history was Star Wars The Phantom Menace, and we
Yes.
beat it. Video
Yeah.
games prior to that had either not held themselves up in that same regard or the numbers didn't warrant it. It was a shot across the bow, not to the industry, but to the broader spectrum. Our success was picked up by the New York Times and the Washington Post and all the national dailies that this was the biggest 24 hours in entertainment retail history." So huge success right out the gate. The biggest selling points of the Dreamcast to the consumers were its ability to emulate arcade games better than any other console, the ability to use 4 controllers, and the visual memory unit, or VMU, which put a tiny screen in the controller that you could, remove it. You can play rudimentary mini games on the screen, like Power Stone and Sonic Adventure had little mini games you could play.
Rudimentary is the best way to say it.
You could also get secondary. I mean, it was like Tamagotchi levels of display. It was not like a Wii U or anything like that.
What came? Do we know like what led to the decision for the VMU to even exist?
I
Like,
don't. I was looking up and I couldn't find any information. I'm assuming it's just to differentiate themselves further.
and maybe capitalize on the popularity of virtual pets. I don't know. Like,
It
it
could
was
have
just
been.
so. It was crazy. Like just like being on like the school bus and like seeing different people like holding their VMUs, and I'm just like, what is happening right now?
So in addition to those mini games, which again, very rudimentary, you could also get
Yeah.
secondary information on the screen, like your health and ammo in Dino Crisis, or if you're playing NFL 2K and you didn't want the person you're playing against to see what play you're choosing, you could select secret plays on the VMU, which is, stuff that would eventually come to consoles like the Wii U.
Mm,
And
mm.
then you could also, if you had 2 VMUs, you could tap them, put them together, and you could trade items. Like in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, you could like put your characters on their game. Power Stone 2, items that you collected, you could send to your friends. So very cool stuff. But of those 3 big selling points, the arcade ports, the VMU, and having 4 controllers, what was the biggest point for you that like got you excited?
I mean, I think the VMU is like the most unique thing, honestly. Um, it just like the idea of being able to like take whatever I was doing and do something with it on the go. That's with Sonic in particular. I think that was just like, I don't know, like that just blew my mind.
Mm-hmm. And it was almost like a Tamagotchi thing because you had the Chow Garden in Sonic
Right.
Adventure, and you could just take your Chow for like a walk or like take him on the go and like play games with him and everything. And
Yeah.
it was a really novel concept, and I'm glad that like there is some love for that still. But I think the biggest one for me was the arcade ports because
Yeah,
there were so many good ones. Like Soul Calibur was the best example, I think, but there were a ton of other games. It was like, oh, this is the best version of this game.
yeah, yeah. So when you had a Dreamcast, did you like play a lot of the arcade games, or like did you have like friends come over? Like, is that what you did?
I did play a lot of the arcade games. Soul Calibur was my favorite, but there were other games like Power Stone 2 that I loved playing with my friends. Toy Commander was another one that I played a lot
Mm.
with my friends. But mostly I was just inviting them over and being like, look at this console. Like, we've been playing Nintendo 64. Look at these graphics. Like,
Yeah,
look at
this
Sonic
was.
Adventure's opening cutscene.
I know. Yeah,
Like, God, like it was ridiculous. So, speaking of Sonic Adventure, the three most popular launch titles in the US were Sonic Adventure, Soul Calibur, and NFL 2K. But listen to the other like notable launch titles on this
yeah.
18 game lineup: Power Stone, Hydro Thunder, Mortal Kombat Gold, House of the Dead 2, Ready to Rumble Boxing, and NFL Blitz 2000. Those were all games that launched alongside the Dreamcast. That is a good lineup.
That's a good spread.
It
Like
is.
that's a lot of variety. You have something there for everybody.
You really do. And, Sonic Adventure was probably the most notable since it signaled kind of like the true return of their mascot and gave us like the first entry in what we now know as the modern Sonic games.
Mm,
And it also gave, a wider cast of fully voiced characters, multiple storylines,
music.
completely new gameplay style, and the music. That's where you're talking about. That was the one that got a personal connection with both of us, but mostly
Yeah.
you. It introduced us both to the sounds of Crush 40.
Yeah. It was just like I didn't know that games could have this kind of music. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
know that they could do that. And it it was just like just so mind-blowing, and just like obviously my relationship with Johnny, like that was the springboard for all of that. And yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and for people who didn't listen to All Things Gamers, can you give an abridged version of how we both heard Crush 40 and we're like, wow, we've never heard video game music like this before.
Yeah.
And then, I got really into his other bands and started listening to Crush 40's like non-video game music. And
Yeah.
by the way, the guitarist of Crush 40 is Jun Senoway, who has been doing music for the Sonic franchise since the Genesis days. He's still working on the music of the Sonic franchise. But yeah, how did you develop this personal relationship with Johnny?
So Johnny was doing a charity for a family friend, 17-year-old kid who got into a diving accident, became paralyzed from the neck down, and he was also making his solo album at the time,
Mm.
and he was using his solo album to help promote charity for his family friend. And so this was 2016. I reached out on Facebook to his manager, and I said, "Look, Johnny's like my Paul McCartney. Is there anything that we can do? What can we do where I can help promote this? Like, I'm graduating medical school. I'm somebody who had spinal surgery. Like, this stuff is very important to me." And we reasoned that I could play some games on Twitch. I played some like Sonic Adventure, Sonic Adventure 2, Sonic and the Black Knight, like that sort of stuff to help draw attention to the charity. And Johnny just loved that. And so we stayed in touch over email, texting, and that sort of thing. But then the pandemic happened, and we finally actually met in person. So he was having trouble finding a place where to get his COVID booster. And I was working at the time at a major vaccine site.
Mm.
And I live in New Jersey, he lives in Connecticut. And basically it was like, bro, I can't find anywhere to get my booster. I'm going back on tour. What do I do? And I'm like, well, you live like 3 hours away from me, and I work at a vaccine site. Do you want to just come here and I'll do it myself? And so I gave him and his wife their vaccines, which was like an insane moment for me. That was like the first time that I met him.
You're like, don't mess up, don't mess up,
Don't mess up, don't mess up. Important arm, you know. And then we like went out to dinner, and like that from that point forward, we've basically been family. He's my best friend. He's kind of like another dad for me. I've done the holidays with him and his family, and he's come here, and we do charity work together for adults that for autistic adults and neurodiverse adults. We've gotten to meet you And that's been something very special for us as well. And so it's just it it's so insane, the trajectory that life can have, and yeah, I wouldn't trade it for anything. And so look, if video games, if the Dreamcast led to this, then it was worth it.
Yeah. And I mean, Crush 40 also was heavily influential for me because I played Sonic Adventure and I was like, wow, the music in this game is amazing. Bolstered by Open Your Heart, which is the theme that Crush 40
Yeah,
did. Um,
that's
and
your favorite, right?
it's hard to say because like it probably is, but like Live and Learn is so good for Sonic Adventure 2, and then What I'm Made of in Sonic Heroes is unbelievable.
Mm.
Even the stuff in Shadow the Hedgehog I really love, even though I don't particularly like that game too much.
Sonic and the Black Knight also had some great tracks.
Yeah, I know your favorite is in that one.
Yeah, yeah. Night of the Wind.
Yeah.
I even have a replica of June's Sonic guitar that my parents got me when I graduated medical school.
Oh wow.
And I don't know how to play it, but they wanted to do something special, and so like I think like less than 100 of these guitars were made. They tracked one down in the UK, and yeah,
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I've
yeah,
gotten a chance to meet Johnny in person one time at the
yes,
Sonic 25th anniversary at San
yeah,
Diego Comic-Con almost a decade ago now. And then also June Senaway came in as well at the tail end of my conversation with Johnny. And then obviously I FaceTimed with you and Johnny
yeah.
a few months back, and that was really awesome as well. Yeah, he seems like truly one of the best
And
people.
we're gonna get to do some cool things.
Yeah,
It'll
I sure
happen.
hope so
It'll
in
happen.
the very near future. I'm hoping
Yeah.
we can figure out something to do collaborative and work on that. But yeah, Crush 40, an immensely immensely important band for you, an immensely important band for me. It really shaped my taste in music going forward as well.
Can I share a quick anecdote regarding the movie?
Go for it.
Because I listened to your episode from last week where you talked about the movie trailer,
Hmm.
and just how good was that movie trailer,
God,
right?
it was unbelievable. I was like, my parents have not seen a second of the Sonic movies. They
Yeah,
they were in town, and I was like, "Hey, I just watched this on my phone. Can I put it up on the TV?" And they watched,
yeah.
and they're like, "Oh, that looks pretty cool."
It's just so like it's insane to see that we're seeing a movie for Sonic Adventure 2,
Yeah.
basically. And like it's that's such like a galaxy brain concept that like I don't think could have existed. Um when Johnny came here for his vaccine and we went out to dinner, we're talking about the Sonic movie because the first one had come out. And I'm like, so do you think that you're going to be in the second one? And he's like, I don't know, bro. I don't think so. And I'm like, Johnny, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't think so either. And he's like, why? Because Johnny doesn't really know the games that much. And he's gone on interviews to say that he's more of the music. He doesn't focus too much on the games. I've introduced him to the games that he's been in,
Hmm.
and his reactions are insane. Like when I'm playing Sonic Adventure 2 at his place and I'm playing as Knuckles and you hear the ding ding
Oh
ding
my
ding because
god.
he's like, are you defusing a bomb? Like what's going on here? And so anyway, he's like, why no Crush 40? And I'm like, because it's gonna have Knuckles.
Mm.
Knuckles is not synonymous with Crush 40. You're gonna be in movie 3.
Wow, look at you being
You're gonna be in
prophetic.
movie 3. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, movie 3 will have Shadow. I'm sure of it. It's either going to have Shadow or Metal Sonic. You put Shadow in the movie and you don't have a Sonic song or a Crush 40 song, stupid. You slap a sword in Sonic's hand and you don't have a Crush 40 song, very stupid. So,
Well, we'll see if it ends up having one.
yeah.
I'm excited to see if I mean it has to have Live and Learn. Like I'm not asking for any inside information here, but it has to have Live and Learn. I'm not saying you even know if there's any information there, but like it would be very weird if there wasn't some kind of like even just like instrumental Live and Learn while something happens. Or credit scene. I don't know.
It being in the trailer, I think bodes very well. Um, I hope that we I honestly don't know if Live and Learn is in the movie. I hope that it is, and I hope it's his version.
Yeah. I mean, there's always the chance that they get like I don't know. I don't even want to like posit what band, what big name band they would get to cover it. Like Five Finger Death Punch, or they? I don't know. I'm not a
Dave
big.
Grohl.
Oh yeah, get the Foo Fighters to. Oh my god, though. But like the Foo Fighters covering Live and Learn would be like,
Yeah,
what is happening?
yeah. That'd be pretty wild.
But no, I would love the Crush 40 version as well.
Yeah.
But let's get back to Dreamcast here, Ben.
Yes.
So it launched in the US, sold out immediately, fastest selling console in history at that point.
Mm.
Launched in Europe a month later, also sold beyond expectations. And then, unfortunately, very shortly after that, they had to drop the price from 200 euros to 150 euros because the sales started slowing really rapidly. And even then, it continued slowing. And then the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and a console from Microsoft called the Xbox were on the very near horizon, and sales began to decline in all Western markets just a few months later. So, History of Video Games, in Steve Kent's book, the sales started noticeably slowing down just 4 months after the US launch in September of 1999. So, January 2000, they started noticing a pretty precipitous decline. And, it continued selling pretty well in the US and Europe, but the Dreamcast just did not fare well in Japan, which caused Sega to continue struggling financially. And it posted its third consecutive annual loss at that point. And at the same time, Sega was also coming to terms with having to reconcile with another major sector in decline for this business, which is the arcades.
Mm.
So if you've ever been to Japan, well, maybe not so much now, but prior to COVID, especially, Sega had arcades everywhere, and that was
Yeah.
even more true in the '90s. And around this time, just to help it out financially, Sega had to close nearly 250 arcade locations in Japan as a result of the arcade business really starting to change. Now we know, like, the arcades have contracted so much that it's barely a business at this point. But in the '90s, arcades were everywhere.
In the US though, they also had like restaurants, GameWorks, right?
Yeah, GameWorks, they had Dave and Buster's.
Yeah.
Or are you talking about Sega?
Sega
Oh,
was
I didn't know Sega owned
I
GameWorks.
think Sega owned GameWorks, or they
Huh.
had like some sort of like stake in GameWorks, because I remember when I was in medical school, like one of my semesters, I was in Miami, Florida, and there was like a GameWorks there, and I remember looking it up, and it's like, yeah, this is partially owned by Sega Sammy.
So originally created as a joint venture in 1996 from Sega, DreamWorks, and Universal Studios.
Yeah,
What a weird combination of companies.
yeah, I know. Yeah, like that's crazy.
Yeah.
Like, and so I here's an anecdote. I remember, because I was like, Johnny, like, what do you think about like the Dreamcast? Like, look, all I know is about the Dreamcast is that one day I was talking with June, and June said, Johnny, Sega is not doing hardware anymore. They're going to just be doing software. No more hardware, just software. And
Mm.
Johnny said, I don't know what that means, but I trust you.
I've interviewed several developers on that topic, and we'll talk about a little bit once we get to that point.
Yeah.
So in 1999, Sega released in Japan a massive title for the Dreamcast called Shenmue, which was the creation of Yu Suzuki, who is the man behind Hang On, Space Harrier, and Outrun, as well as other arcade games. And the game was a huge critical success. I think it had an 89% on game rankings, got several tens. Notably, I noticed that Game Informer gave it a 6 out of 10, which is very funny. At one point, Shenmue was my favorite video game of all time.
Wow.
I loved it. I mean, now it's kind of, faded. It's probably like a top 20 game for me now, but it was just, I was obsessed with this game. I played it on repeat. It's unbelievable. And it actually sold pretty well. It sold very well in Japan, but it even sold pretty well being when it was released a year later in 2000 in the US, even though it was a very Japanese centric game, like it's, following a character walking around the streets of a Japanese city. So, unfortunately, despite it selling relatively well, the Dreamcast didn't have enough installed users in its base to make it profitable. And I saw estimates anywhere from $45 million to $90 million, or I'm sorry, $77 million to estimates of how much money this costs. So there was just no way with the number of Dreamcasts on the market that it could have become profitable, even if everybody bought one, you know?
Right, right.
Did you ever check this game out?
I never checked out Shenmue. I was just looking it up while you were talking. Um, I never got to check it out. But I've heard of it. I never really knew what it was about. Like it's an action adventure game basically.
Yeah, so you take control of Ryo Hazuki,
Mm,
and basically his father is murdered, and his father was like this martial arts expert, and you were his trainee, and or apprentice, or whatever, and you know you go on this quest for revenge of your father's murderer. And it's one of the coolest opening scenes in any video game, where
mm.
Lan Di, who is like this mega crime lord or something, comes in and just like beats the crap out of your dad and leaves him for dead, basically. And then you go around and like, but it's not just like, all right, I'm just going to fight through room after room of people. You're going around, you're talking to folks, like trying to investigate clues, follow leads, like, oh, well, there's this person who might know something, but they're only here at these hours of the day. And there was actually an in-game clock that you could go and like talk to people, and you'd have to like interview people. This was also the first game to use at least in the mainstream, to use QuickTime events, where
You're tickling this the Persona lover in me.
I mean, it is action style combat though, and I
Yeah.
mean the combat is extremely rare actually. But you go and you can take jobs, like you can be a forklift driver. You can go spend your day throwing darts at the arcade or playing like arcade games. Like there's Outrun and Space Harrier are in there in full. You just have to go to the arcade and play them. You can use gotcha machines.
This also sounds a little bit like Yakuza.
It very much is. I've tried and tried and tried to get the developers behind Yakuza to admit that Shenmue was an inspiration to them, because
Right.
I mean, look at it. It very much it feels like it took inspiration from the Shenmue series, and they're
It
like,
also
"Oh no,
sounds a
it didn't."
little like Sifu.
Yeah, I mean, not quite as technical in terms of like,
No.
but you can meet up with other like masters and learn moves from them. I would
Right.
say that the combat it was mostly inspired by Virtua Fighter's fighting system. So
Interesting.
you would go into these combat situations and suddenly like you'd be fighting like all these different guys, and it would almost feel like a Virtua Fighter game. There were combos you could pull off and everything. So it was a way ahead of its time game. Another one of those.
Yeah.
So in 2000, there was a big shakeup at Sega. Peter Moore took over for Bernie Stolar as president and COO of Sega of America, and Sega chairman Isao Okawa, who actually was the one who overruled everybody else to put the modem on the Dreamcast, despite everybody's objections. He took over for Iramajiri in May of 2000. So big shakeups in 2000. Also around this time, Okawa invested in a small company that was privately trading at the time called Nvidia,
Mm.
and he put $5 million into that. And then years later, Sega could sell that for $15 million when it went public.
Yeah.
So good investment there. Moore decided that he needed to combat the upcoming PlayStation 2 by leaning heavily into the Dreamcast's ability to play online. So he used the modem to launch SegaNet in September of 2000, and you had to pay $22 a month to play online. And did you ever play anything online with Dreamcast?
No. Like
Neither did I.
there were when I was playing Sonic Adventure 2, there were like I would go online and I would like just on my computer and I'd see like wait, there are different costumes. What is this Fantasy Star Online? Like all this other like all this like weird stuff that I had never heard of. And it was just crazy. Like and I was just like how do I do this? And it's like, "Oh, like plug your Dreamcast into your Ethernet thing." And I like looked at the back of the Dreamcast and I would like look at the Ethernet thing and I'm like, I'm not gonna mess around with this. This doesn't look like I should do. I'm just a kid. I don't think that's the right idea.
So the only games in the US that featured
Yeah.
online play at the launch of SegaNet were Choo Choo Rocket, and NFL 2K1, which launched the same day as SegaNet. And apparently it was actually a very big selling point for NFL 2K1. I bought NFL 2K1 having no idea you could play online.
Look, let nobody tell you that Choo Choo Rocket and NBA 2K1 don't have anything in common, because
NFL
apparently they do.
2K1.
NFL 2K1.
By the way,
Yeah,
Choo Choo
they do.
Rocket is a lot of fun. I recently played it with 4 players, and it was so fun. I need to play more of that. That was a blast.
That's cool.
So those were the only 2 games at the launch of SegaNet, but eventually franchises like Bomberman, Unreal Tournament, and Quake would come to Dreamcast and offer online play as well. So we're reaching kind of like D-Day here. PlayStation 2 is looming. Sega had dropped the price of the Dreamcast in the US to $150, which was half the price of the PS2's launch price of $300, and even offered a $150 mail-in rebate if you subscribed to SegaNet. So basically, if you bought a Dreamcast at $150, you could basically get it rebated for free if you subscribe to SegaNet. And they also offered bonuses like SegaNet subscription, like you'd get a free Dreamcast keyboard. Like they were trying everything to try to get people in.
How do they have the money for all this stuff, but they don't have the money to keep themselves above what? Like,
well, it turns out they didn't, because all the Dreamcasts were being sold at a loss, and all of these rebates and price cuts put them in pretty dire straits. But the most dire sign was after the PS2 launched in October of 2000, it was also dealing with shortages. So you would think that the Dreamcast would have like the clear runway to be like, okay, well, we're going to dominate this holiday season.
Right, yeah.
But it was actually a re-release of the PlayStation 1 called PS1 that ended up being the highest selling game of the 2000 holiday season, or the highest selling console. So according to Business Week, I dug up this article, Moore said that he aimed to sell 5 million Dreamcasts by the end of 2000, but Sega only sold 3 million by the end of 2000, so fell well short of the mark. And then on top of that, those price cuts and rebates led to additional losses in the tens of billions of dollars. And then by the end of 2000, PlayStation had sold 5 times as many PS1 units as Dreamcast. So the writing was kind of on the wall. Okawa, who'd recently taken over, he already wanted to get out of the hardware business. And in January 2001, Sega announced the discontinuation of the Dreamcast that would be effective 2 months later in March 2001. I had spoken in the time since with Mizuguchi, who is the creator of Rez, and Takashi Iizuka, who is the head of Sonic Team, and they all were like, yeah, that was a really stressful time, but we were also like, after we like the news settled, it was like excitement of like, hey, we can develop for other consoles, and like obviously we were struggling to like sell games because like there weren't that many people who owned a Dreamcast. So now we can actually reach them on like these really high selling consoles.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. Like it felt like the Dreamcast just sort of like came and there was like no fan, at least for me as like a fan as a gamer, that couldn't really follow any sort of gaming news other than like whatever was in a magazine, because it was still early days of the internet. Like I wasn't really, I just remember like going to Toys R Us and there just wasn't any more Dreamcasts. Like it just wasn't, like it just sort of like came and just went without any sort of fanfare.
Yeah. So I found an interview with Peter Moore for The Guardian, and he said, quote, "We had a tremendous 18 months. Dreamcast was on fire. We really thought that we could do it. But then we had a target from Japan that said we had to make X hundreds of millions of dollars by the holiday season and shift X millions of units of hardware. Otherwise, we just couldn't sustain the business. Somehow I got to make the call, not the Japanese. I had to fire a lot of people. It was not a pleasant day. So on January 31st, 2001, we said Sega is leaving hardware. We were selling 50,000 units a day, then 60,000, then 100,000, but it was just not going to be enough to get the critical mass to take on the launch of the PS2. It was a big stakes game. Sega had the option of pouring in more money and going bankrupt, and they decided they wanted to live to fight another day."
I have a question. I heard that there was an investor or something, or who was like dying of like cancer or something, and he sold all of his or he gave all of his shares before he died to Sega, and that prevented them from going bankrupt.
Oh, I don't know that story.
Okay.
I mean, that sounds like an urban legend, but it also sounds like it could very well have been real. Like,
Yeah,
there's so many serendipitous things that like just have altered the course of gaming history.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so Dreamcast, very short lifespan, but look at the lineup of games it housed. Like we mentioned a bunch of games already, but some of the ones we haven't mentioned. You talked about Crazy Taxi a little bit.
yeah.
Jet Set Radio, Sega
Yep.
Bass Fishing. Remember the fishing reel
Yeah,
peripheral?
yeah.
I talked about Toy Commander. I talked about Power Stone 2, the Marvel
Tony
vs.
Hawk Pro
Capcom
Skater
games.
2.
Yeah, Tony Hawk Pro Skater, those games, Skies of Arcadia,
Mm-hmm.
Rez, Space Channel 5,
PSO.
yeah, Fantasy Star Online, Dead or Alive 2, Grandia 2, I mean, San Francisco Rush 2049. So many games. We'll be getting into our favorites overall, but when I say Dreamcast, what's the first game that pops into your head?
It's Sonic Adventure.
Mm.
I mean, there's no way it couldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the two that pops in my head. That and Crazy Taxi, just because Crazy
Gotcha.
Taxi is such a like an encapsulation of what the Dreamcast felt like it was, where it was
Yeah,
just like this attitude, this fast-paced nature. It felt like the true like continuation of the Genesis era attitude that Sega had, but now it was in like the arcades, and then like you were able to bring it home and play it on your Dreamcast, and it felt so novel in that way.
it was rebellious.
Yeah, it,
Yeah,
it really had that rebellious attitude. Same thing with Jet Set Radio, but Crazy Taxi resonated more with me.
yeah.
So I really love that. But Dreamcast discontinued, gone too soon, some would say, but based on the business numbers, I don't know if it necessarily was gone too soon.
I, it's one of those things where it had to exist and it had to fail in order for other things to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
That's a shame, but I'm grateful for it even existing to begin with.
Well, according to Hideki Sato, the guy who was in charge of finding those initial specs for the Dreamcast, they talked to him about Shenmue, and they were like, "Hey, like this is not going to be a profitable game." And he's like, "Yeah, but like the lessons that we will learn from making this game will be so invaluable because it's such a novel concept that we're going to learn lessons and be able to apply those to future games."
Yeah,
So it was really, really like important for them to develop that, even if they were taking it a loss. And hold on one second. No, he was not involved with the Yakuza franchise. I was just seeing
okay. You were
if
trying to find it.
I was like, wait a second.
Was he involved with Persona? Probably not.
I mean, no, because that's Atlas.
Yeah, true.
But
Yeah,
as a result of the Dreamcast going under, Sega became a third-party developer, and games like Sonic Adventure 2 and the Sega Sports games began appearing on other platforms, most notably the GameCube. Do you remember what went through your mind the first time you saw Sonic on a GameCube?
I remember where I was. I remember being in 7th grade math class, and somebody brought in an issue of Nintendo Power. And I saw Sonic with his soap shoes on there, and I'm like, what the hell is going on? This is crazy. It's I had so many like I can't even like describe like the electrical impulse that like went in my brain, and I was just like, wow, is that even legal? Like, how is this happening? Now, I didn't end up getting a GameCube until Animal Crossing came out.
Oh wow, that was the
Yeah,
game that did it.
yeah, and and I didn't end up getting Sonic Adventure 2 Battle because I was like, I already have Sonic Adventure 2, and I felt like Sonic Adventure personally, what at least at the time was the better game.
Fair.
It was the one that changed everything for me. I think I do have Sonic Adventure DX,
Mm-hmm.
and I did end up getting that, which actually came out after SA2 for the GameCube.
It did, yes. It was very
Yeah.
strange in that
It's
release.
so weird, and so but like just seeing like all like that's just it was crazy.
So Sega continued releasing games on the Dreamcast, including Sonic Adventure 2, but eventually that well ran dry. And some games that released on Dreamcast in Japan actually had to find new homes in the US. The most prominent example that I can think of is how Shenmue 2 came to the US on Xbox, but in Japan it's Dreamcast, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah. Wow.
So we talk about how the Saturn was kind of a failure by selling 9 million units. The Dreamcast ended up selling just over 9 million units. So, unfortunately, not a huge success, but
Not a failure.
not a failure, but like definitely fell short of expectations. They thought this was
Yeah.
going to be their big reemergence in console market. But also, like Peter Moore said, they had about 18 months before they started phasing this thing out. So it wasn't like it had
Yeah.
a giant life cycle. But here's the good news, right? After 5 straight years of financial losses, Sega had its first profitable fiscal year in 2003. So I guess it was the right call.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, if it's one of those things where you have to sort of like push out a bunch of people in order to like activate your parachute, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
It's insane.
Yeah. So in the time since the Dreamcast, Sega has continued being a major player in the third-party publishing and development space. Obviously, Sonic is still a massive property, and according to my conversations with Takashi Iizuka, he's saying he's seen more enthusiasm surrounding the brand than ever before. And he said the line of demarcation there was when the first movie hit theaters, and it really felt like there was an entirely new audience being
The first
exposed to
Sonic
Sonic.
movie, you
Yeah, the
mean?
first Sonic movie.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that I don't know what it is about like the human condition, but it's something about movies that we realize like, oh, that's big. Like,
Mm-hmm.
forget about the fact that we've had years of built-in audience with games and TV shows and comics and toys and all that sort of stuff. But it's movies. It's this one like big thing that I don't know. Psychologically, we all are just like, that is it. That is when you know that you've made it big.
We have this weird like little brother syndrome in video games where it's
Mm,
like we feel like we need like validation from the longer standing, longer tenured entertainment media,
yes.
whether that be
Yes.
TV shows or movies or anybody outside of the games industry referencing. I think that's going away because gaming has become such a like ubiquitous part of culture now. But like
But
for a long time that has been the case where it's like, oh my god, it's a movie that's so much bigger than games. But it's not. Gaming is the highest grossing entertainment property, or the highest grossing entertainment medium in the world.
if I were to talk to any of my peers or anybody that's not in gaming or like family members not in gaming and mention Zelda, they're like, "What's that?" But if a Zelda movie came out, then
Mhm.
they would understand it.
Yeah, I think there's just different promotional engines that roar, and especially once celebrities get involved, like that's when
Yeah.
people really start taking notice, or like theatrical releases, because for people who don't like, not everybody games, but everybody at least pays attention to movies.
Yeah. Going back to what Azuka said, though, I think he's right, though. The line of demarcation, because like before the first movie, there wasn't a lot of like in the public eye a lot of goodwill towards Sonic.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, there people just kept on going for like low hanging fruit, like Sonic '06 and whatever, and like that's the easiest target that you've got, um, and Sonic Boom and all of that, like, and so I think like that was the big success, and the success for it to be a movie. That's huge.
And it was better than anybody expected as well. Like it ended up being a huge success. They listened to the fans by redoing the Sonic model. But yeah, so
Which can
Sonic,
be a dangerous thing. I just want to say that, like,
it can
listening to
be.
the fans is not like if you are working for a major studio, you shouldn't just be immediately like, let's listen to the fans because the fans know what to do. No, dude, you've produced movies your whole life. Like you went to school for this. Like you know what to do. I don't think that we would have had the redesign and all of the other things that happened for the movie if it wasn't for Jeff Fowler, who
Yeah.
did work on Shadow the Hedgehog and who did have like an association with the franchise built in before coming in and directing. And so I think that that was all really important.
100%, yeah. But Sega's also has these other franchises that are very popular as well. That is continued publishing and developing, even created in some places. Super Monkey Ball, Samba de Amigo, Streets of Rage, Bayonetta, Two Point, Virtua Fighter, Total War, the Yakuza / Like a Dragon series, and Fantasy Star. And then they've also acquired other studios like Atlas and Rovio. So now they have Shin Megami Tensei, Persona, Angry Birds, and other franchises in those umbrellas.
When will we see more Billy Hatcher?
I don't know. I mean, we have seen recently, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
I don't know, semi.
Yeah.
And Sega would actually own Visual Concepts and the 2K sports franchises until they sold the studio and the IP rights to Grand Theft Auto publisher Take-Two Interactive in 2005, who would go on to found the 2K Games and 2K Sports label, which Visual Concepts became a part of. That is still going strong to this day. And now we get to the where are they now section for the people that we talked about. So after leaving Sega in 1999, Bernie Stolar joined Mattel, and then he joined Adscape Media and Google. Unfortunately, he passed away at the age of 75 in 2022. Okawa sadly passed away of heart failure in 2001.
Wow.
He was still serving as the chairman of Sega. He was 74. And then after leaving Sega in 2000, Iramajiri would leave the games industry and work in the automotive industry. And I found an article on Polygon covering an interview with Peter Moore that he did with Glixel, which is the now defunct Rolling Stone gaming vertical. So as one of Peter Moore's final acts with Sega in late 2002, he flew to Japan to prevent some focus group findings that said teens no longer found Sega cool. So here's what he said. Get ready. Yuji Naka-san, maker of Sonic, is in the room. Now he and I have a love-hate relationship on a good day. And we show him this, and it's subtitled in Japanese. And when it comes to that piece, he just slams his hand on the table. This is ridiculous. You have made them say this. Sega is a great brand. Nobody would ever say this. You have falsified. He just gets in my face. So I said to the translator, tell him to fuck off. And the poor guy looks at me and says, there's no expression in Japanese. I said, I know there is. And that was it. That was the last time I ever sat foot in there.
Oh my God.
And Moore left Sega a few months later, mid 2003. He joined Microsoft, where he helped launch the Xbox 360. He became well known in the industry for getting tattoos on his arm to announce various game news. So most notably, he announced Halo 2's release date through a tattoo and Grand Theft Auto 4's existence by showing a tattoo on stage. In 2007, he left Microsoft to join Electronic Arts. He would head up EA Sports. He was then promoted to COO of EA Sports in 2011, but left in 2017, get this, to become the CEO of Liverpool Football Club. And he left Liverpool in 2020 and now works at Unity Technologies, where he works on the game engine.
Couldn't quite be the next Ryan Reynolds, I guess.
So yeah, what a crazy career trajectory for Peter Moore there. But
does he still have the tattoos?
There's conflicting information of whether the Halo one in particular was a permanent or temporary, but I've seen people claiming he still has it.
Okay.
But after the Dreamcast bowed out, we were left with the three major players who still exist in the game space today: PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo. Which of those three do you most closely associate with Sega today?
Probably Nintendo, 100%.
Same.
Like, I just seeing that like Nintendo Power cover with Sonic on the front of it is just that's such a powerful image like burned in my brain. Sonic Heroes being like getting that on GameCube and being like, wow, this is like the first new Sonic game on a Nintendo console.
On a console, yes, because Sonic Advance had come out prior to that, but yeah, on a console.
On a console, like this was groundbreaking. Yeah, Sonic Advance was like also like crazy to experience, like having that on Game Boy Advance. I was like, what is happening? But like, it's 100% Nintendo, and I know that Sonic Heroes did come out also for Xbox and PlayStation and all that and whatever, but it felt like a bigger deal that it was on Nintendo. Anything that Sega did going forward with Nintendo, it was like, when are we getting the Sonic and Mario team up? That was like the first and last thought in my brain every single time. When I was in college, I remember like I was like in a biology class and I like was not listening to the professor, unfortunately. And then I was on the internet and I saw that they announced Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games. And I just wanted to like I didn't know what I wanted to do. Like I was like sitting in between two different people, and I was like, I don't like this is what this is a weird thing that just like I just saw. This can't be real. This has to be a parody. This is insane. Like why them
Well,
at that location?
I mean, I did actually interview both Izuka and Miyamoto about that, and basically Miyamoto was like, if we want to do a game where these two are crossing over, which he had wanted to do for a while, and he'd been in talks with Izuka about doing for a while, it had to not be like an action game because like the speed would just be different for those characters.
Yeah,
So Izuka's idea was like, hey, what if we did it like the Olympics? Because like Sega had just acquired the rights to the Olympic Games, and that
yeah.
way, like Sega or Sonic is representing like the Sega nation, and Mario and his friends are representing the Nintendo nation. They're coming together to compete, which I think is a pretty clever way to do that.
It is a really clever way of doing that. And then I remember where I was when they announced Sonic for Super Smash Brothers Brawl. I was like in my dorm. It was like 9 a.m. It dropped on like the Super Smash Brothers website, and like I woke up one of my roommates and I was like, Neil. I like tugged on his arm because it was draped over our bunk bed, and I was like, hey, Sonic's in Brawl. He's like, okay, whatever, tell Paul. I then went over to Paul. Now Paul was an MMA fighter. He did not like me waking him up.
Oh no.
That was unpleasant for both of us.
So why did you tell him?
I was just so excited. I then went over to my friend Tommy, and I was like, "Did you hear?" He's like, "Yeah, Sonic's and Brawl." And I'm like, "Let's play all the Sonic games." We didn't end up doing that because that would have been insane. But it was just all of that was just crazy. Like,
Yeah.
and you don't have that without everything that happened beforehand.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to close out this segment talking about the top 10 best-selling games for the Dreamcast. I'm just going to read them off, and then we're going to take a break and get to our favorite games of Dreamcast.
Yeah.
So here's the top 10. Sonic Adventure number 1, then Shenmue, then Resident Evil Code Veronica, NFL 2K, Crazy Taxi rounds out the top 5, NFL 2K1, Soul Calibur, NBA 2K1, Sonic Adventure 2, and then our dear friend Seaman, rounding out the top 10. What's the biggest surprise there?
You know what it is. It's Seaman. I didn't even know that.
I told
that
you it was a big
existed.
success in
That
Japan.
was a big success. I'm not sure. My gut says Seaman, which is
Probably
not a sentence
is.
I want to say. but yeah, no. It doesn't surprise me that Sonic Adventure was up there too.
Well, yeah. I think everybody got Sonic Adventure when they got their Dreamcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm with you. I think Seaman's probably the biggest surprise there.
That one surprised you. How did it do here in the States?
I think it did relatively well, but not as well as it did in Japan. Like it was like a big success in Japan. I think it was a relatively like a cult classic game in the States.
How did they get Leonard Nimoy?
Hey, open up the money, open up the wallet.
Yeah.
But Ben, we're going to take a quick break, and when we get back, we're going to do definitive ranking and get a quick eShop gem of the week from you. We will be right back. We are back, and it's time for definitive ranking, a recurring segment where we take a topic and give our own personal top 5 lists. Since this episode was all about the Dreamcast, this list pretty much decided itself. Ben, I want your top 5 Dreamcast games. So start at 5, count it down to 1, give me a quick sentence or two about each.
Here's the thing. I didn't own more than 3, but the other 2, I would play at like Best Buy or like at a friend's place. So I would say Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. It was just like a lot of fun.
That's your number 5?
Yeah, that's my number 5. I probably played it the least, just like playing around with that. I felt like I had never played anything like that before. I didn't even play Pro Skater 1.
Oh,
it was
wow.
new for me. Yeah.
That was the reason I bought a PS1 was Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1.
Wow. Yeah. I felt like I was very insular with my game choices until way later in life. Mm-hmm. The number 4 is probably Virtua Tennis number 2.
Oh,
Virtua Tennis 2.
Okay.
I remember going to my friend's home, and they had a Dreamcast, and I got to fire it up, and it just looked so real, and it was just so crazy. Number 3 is probably Sonic Shuffle, which is just like such a goofy game. And like, it's a Mario Party knockoff. Fine, whatever. I didn't like get a lot of hours into it, but it was fun. It was fun for what it was. It was a fun party game. And
I mean, that's generous.
that's the nicest thing I can say about it.
Okay.
And then number 2 is Sonic Adventure 2.
Mm-hmm.
And then number 1 is Sonic Adventure 1. And the reason for that is, while I think Sonic Adventure 2 has the better story-ish, yes, it does have the better story. Now that I'm like really like pressing against it, it has the better story. It has better level design.
Mm-hmm. It has Shadow.
It has Shadow. But Sonic Adventure 1 had such a revolutionary way of telling a story that I had never seen as a kid before.
Yeah.
And
perspectives,
yeah, like
you play as.
Like, I'm playing as Sonic and then I see Big just dicking around looking for Froggy or whatever. And then I play Big Story and I see Sonic talking with Tails at that exact same moment from previous. And I'm just like that did things for my brain where I'm like, it activated a certain part of my brain that I can't really articulate, but I understand a lot better in terms of storytelling. And it definitely like led to me understanding other storytelling and other like forms of media.
Yeah, it really, really like revolutionized how I like approach storytelling in a lot of things, because like I loved that, like, yeah, like you said, you'd like have a fight with Knuckles and it's like, oh well, that's where their storylines are crossing over.
Yeah.
And then you'd play the Knuckles story and it's like, oh well, here, this is where that point, it gave you a perspective of like the time of everything is happening.
Yeah.
It was so smartly done.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are your top 5? And is Sonic Shuffle on that list?
Sonic Shuffle is not in the top 20.
Okay.
Number 5 is Virtua Tennis, the first one.
Wow.
This was a game that I learned the rules of tennis, and then later I would go on to actually make my high school tennis team, having never picked up a racket before.
What?
I loved Virtua Tennis so much. It was so much fun. I would have friends over. We would play doubles. Like,
wow.
It was just a blast.
I learned the rules of tennis from it, and then I forgot them. End of story.
I love tennis, so like I this is like the start of my love of tennis, so I had to give it a shout out.
Yeah.
Number 4 for me was Power Stone 2. It was an amazing evolution of the first Power Stone. I'm so excited that these games are coming back in the the Capcom Fighting Collection 2 that was announced in the recent Nintendo Partner Direct.
Yes.
Power Stone 2 was just so chaotic. You can, just throwing stuff at each other, and like there's 4 players instead of 2. It's a zoomed out map. You can jump in turrets. Once you get like you're kind of like your super form, like it's just like all bets are off and you're just like slapping each other around. It's just one of the most fun, underrated games from that era. It hasn't aged particularly well, but I'm excited to revisit it when the Fighting Collection 2 comes out from Capcom. Number 3 is pretty easy to talk about, Sonic Adventure 2. That was a game that I just absolutely adored. Like I said, I liked Shadow's introduction. I liked the storyline of Shadow. I think that they did a lot of really fun stuff with the story there.
You look at San Francisco, you hear City Escape. That's just how it
City
works.
Escape. That was another one of those like revelatory music moments where I know that's not Crush 40, but like that was a fantastic.
It was half of Crush 40. It was June.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, so it was June playing guitar.
Yeah.
Okay. Number 2 for me, Shenmue, for all the reasons I mentioned before. It was just such like an amazing immersive sim, and it introduced QuickTime events, which were extremely novel back then. So it felt like, oh, this is really, I'm like playing a movie right now.
Right.
And you just really were allowed to immerse yourself in this mystery, this like murder mystery and quest for revenge. It was so well made. I loved that game so much. And then you can guess what number 1 is. It's Sonic Adventure. It was a game that made me buy the Dreamcast, and it was fantastic.
Yeah.
It
defined my aesthetic in everything. Even SA2, like I actually owned the soap shoes. Like I bought, like I sought them down.
Did you grind on the rails?
I did. I hurt myself so many times.
It's funny that soap shoes were replaced in like Sonic Adventure 2 Battle and all subsequent releases of Sonic Adventure 2 because
Yeah,
they just the partnership expired. But now you could get them in Sonic
the
Frontiers.
company went under. The
Well, that
company went
explains it.
under. Yeah, but yeah, you can get them in Sonic Frontiers. There's a leak of a Funko Pop that's gonna have Sonic
Ooh,
wearing his grind shoes again.
my God.
So
That's amazing.
yeah, I like that it's back. If it's in the movie, I don't know, man. That
I
would
mean,
be that would be crazy.
did we see Sonic grinding on a rail? Didn't
We
we?
saw him grinding on a vine
That's right. Yes.
or
I
a
remember seeing
tree.
that and being like,
Yeah,
that's got to be an homage to like the soap shoes.
yeah, yeah.
But Ben, that brings us to our final segment. It is the eShop Gem of the Week, a chance for you to give a little bit of shine to a game that might not otherwise get it on this show. So it can be something new, it can be something old. What is your eShop Gem of the Week?
My eShop gem of the week is a little title called Cassette Beasts.
Hmm.
It is I believe it's like $20. Basically, it's kind of like Pokemon, but with like a musical twist to it. And
Oh,
so it like really like tickles a certain itch. I listen to the soundtrack all the time. I actually got to meet the composer, and Joel Bayless, super cool guy. So there's a fusion component where like you get to like fuse monsters together and stuff.
kind of Persona E as well.
Yeah, yeah.
God, you were
Look,
saying too many keywords for me to like
I
resist putting
I
this in
know,
my.
right? Look, there's no new Pokemon release this year. Go check out Cassette Beasts.
It does have a very charming pixel art style.
Yeah,
Has kind of that same isometric, almost top-down perspective as Pokemon.
yeah.
It is a pretty looking game. And if you're saying the music is good, then I'm also in on that. It sounds like the gameplay mechanics. It's turn-based.
Yeah. It's turn based. It's turn
God,
based.
ugh. I'm gonna
Yeah.
have to read some reviews on this one, but I mean I
Nines
trust
out
you.
of
But
tens. Nines out of tens.
come on, Ben.
I'm dead serious. Check
I've
it out,
always
man.
like the bane of my existence. I've said it several times on this show. Is me introducing this segment in the early days of this podcast because it has led to me buying so many games
Yeah.
that I've never heard of or never seen. But also, as you mentioned, it's $20 normally, but it's on sale until September 10th, which unfortunately, like I said, we're pre-recording this episode. That means the sale is over before this episode comes out. So it's going to be
Gotcha.
$20 on the eShop.
Yes.
And it came to Switch in May of last year, but I'm definitely going to have to check this game out. It
Yeah.
looks, God, how did I miss this? That's my question.
Because it came out in May of last year. Zelda came out in May of last year.
Ben, that is a good point.
It was on the heels right after Jedi Survivor, which came out 2 weeks before Zelda. And then Horizon Forbidden West DLC was also right before Jedi. Like that was a weird, 3-4 week period.
Yeah, so the main version is $20, or you can get the digital deluxe edition, which is $26, and that includes the DLC, Peer of the Unknown, plus extra apparel and accessories in the cosplay pack. So I don't know what you're cosplaying, but that sounds like it might be the way to go if it's a story expansion, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a lot of fun. The music is every single song there is a banger. Yeah.
Wow.
Great
Well,
game.
Ben, thank you so much for sharing that, and thank you for joining me for this episode of All Things Nintendo.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. It's always a pleasure when we get together and we get to do this.
And thank you so much to everyone for listening. Do me a favor, if you haven't already, throw All Things Nintendo a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button. If you want to get more All Things Nintendo content, you can join the Patreon paid tiers. And if you want to get any questions or comments in, you can get in touch with me at brian@allthingsnintendo.com. Hit me up on social media at Brian Pichet, or join the community Discord server, which is a perk for joining a paid tier of the Patreon. Also, be sure to find me on YouTube and subscribe to that channel. You can search for All Things Nintendo or visit at Brian Pichet on YouTube. Ben, where can people find you on social media?
You can find me at Dr. Ben MD. I just want to do just a little quick plug.
Go for it.
I'm a doctor. This year, COVID, still happening. The flu, still happening. If you haven't already, go get your COVID and flu shots. It's going to be a rough fall and winter, and it's always best to protect yourself and your loved ones.
Absolutely. I get my vaccines every single time they're available. Flu shot is an annual thing for me.
Yes,
so
thank you.
Very good advice there.
Yeah.
And, you know, the way that a doctor convinced me, because I was like, oh, I never really get that sick, is, yeah, but like if you get it, you can give it to somebody who might get sick.
Exactly. Prevent yourself from taking up a bed that somebody else would need.
Exactly.
I will be getting both on Friday or Saturday this weekend, and then I will be on my ass playing video games.
The best way to be.
Yes.
But that is our show for this week. Thank you again to everyone for listening. Take care. We'll see you next time. Before we wrap up this episode, I just want to give a special shout out to the $10 patrons of the All Things Nintendo podcast: Aaron Smith, Elena R., Alex Stadnick, Andy Junkins, Ben Richlin, Born Orpheus, Brooke Obscura, Chaps My Ass, Colton Bredlau, Derek Sigmund, Ian T. Clark, Jacob Nahin, Jason Thompson, Joar Hello, Jill Grote, Johnny Five, Jordan Sloat, Jose Villalobos, Joseph Jury, Justin Childress, Cody Gibson, Lindsay Hartz, Marshall Thompson, Megan S., Michael Anderson, Toad, Nintendo 101, Pat Roberts, Paul at Drunk on Mako, Pratable, Bobby Mac 265, Roger Reichart, Russell Sayer, Sarah McCarthy, Scott Matthews, Smithy Poo, Tux DC, Wham Bam Sam the Gaming Man, Zach Marcus, and Zachary Pliggy. Thanks to your support of this podcast, I can continue doing this, and it means so much to me. Thank you so much for listening to the show and continuing to support the podcast.